Hello everybody, this is Dr. Hart and I'm going to give you a brief summary of our ideas that we talk about in the text on cognitive transitions. These are the main topics in the text that they talk about as far as changes and transitions for cognition. Thinking about possibilities, thinking about abstract concepts, thinking about thinking in multiple dimensions, and adolescent relativism. As far as thinking about possibilities are concerned, adolescents are much better at thinking about possibilities than young pre-operational thinking children. There are a couple of forms of thinking about possibilities that are important to take into consideration. One is deductive reasoning, in which we draw some logical conclusions from a general set of facts or premises. So the example here is all football players wear camisetas. Eduardo is a football player, so therefore does Eduardo wear a camiseta? Yeah, probably, because he's part of this class of people we call football players who wear camisetas. Another form of thinking about possibilities is hypothetical thinking. This is where we're thinking about what might happen if. And so the example here is, if I were in her situation, I would feel angry too. So an adolescent starts to develop this sense of what would happen if I were in that situation. Before adolescence, children are very egocentric and they have a hard time seeing things through other people's eyes. But adolescents start to develop this to a better degree, and so they're better at doing hypothetical thinking. Now, thinking about abstract concepts, we're going to go back to Piaget's ideas. He said that the children start out in the sensory motor level, where their thinking is dominated by the senses: hearing, tasting, touch, smell, and so on. In pre-operational thinking, language starts to become more mature. The children can think imaginatively, but they still are not completely logical. And I give the example of where if I had 3 large apples and I gave 5 smaller apples to a pre-operational thinking child and asked them who has more, they might look at the 3 large apples that I have and say, "You, Dr. Hart, have more than I do." Well, see, they've got 5 apples. I've only got 3, but my apples are bigger. And so they aren't thinking logically about quantity, they're thinking about size. And then there's concrete operations, and this is where thinking logically is in a more formal way. One's thoughts are not those of others. One realizes that, oh, my thoughts are different from others. However, there's still little hypothetical and abstract thinking. Now, at about 11 years of age, they start to move into formal operations, where there actually is formal and stronger hypothetical thinking. And the adolescents, early adolescence and moving into adolescence, they're thinking in different dimensions. They're asking questions like, what would things look like from there? What would things look like from her perspective? What would things look like from his perspective? Once again, they're growing out of this egocentric stage. They're also thinking in terms of complex operations. So you think about some of the math courses that you might have taken when you were 12, 13, 14 years old. The math operations that you're working on at that time and perhaps involve many different steps. And that's going to be very different from the very simple operations that 6 and 7 and 8-year-olds are working with. And as I said, they're moving beyond the egocentric stage. Now, also, something that adolescents start to develop is a better sense of thinking about thinking. That we call this metacognition. And it's at this stage in adolescent development where children can actually start to ask, well, how did I decide that? Or who should I listen to? Or should I act differently in different situations? I suggest that if you're going to be a counselor or an advisor or a teacher, that at 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, you can actually ask these types of questions and the children will have a response. How did you decide that? Earlier children, 7, 8, 9 years old, if you ask them, how did you decide that? They're going to say, I don't know. Or they're going to say something like, I liked it, or I liked the color, or something like that. They're not going to have the reflection that metacognition comes with. Okay? And we come back to the issue of adolescent egocentrism. There's a suggestion anyway that adolescents can be very egocentric, that they feel that they're the most important person. Sometimes we say that they have what we call an imaginary audience, where they imagine themselves in a role. And this is imaginary and solitary. They can be practicing what they say, or they can practice how they look. Now, this can be positive or it can be kind of negative. On the positive side, it might be good for them to practice how they might talk to different people in different situations, to reflect on this, and to realize that, oh, there might be some different ways of approaching this person, and so I can practice that in an imaginary audience setting. In a not so positive, dysfunctional way, this can be negative because if it's taken to its extreme, the adolescent can lose themselves. They can forget about the boundary between imaginary and real and actually try to play out these imaginary fantasies. And unfortunately, for instance, in the United States, we've seen this all too often with the mass murders, where a young person has become so involved in their imaginary audience experience that they play themselves out in very violent ways. Another example of adolescent egocentrism is having a personal fable, having a personal story. Many times we'll hear adolescents talk about how they think that they might be the result of an imaginary birth, that their parents are not their real parents, that their real parents are imaginary, they're ideal, they're perfect, and their current physical parents are horribly imperfect, and they don't want to have anything to do with them. Another personal fable is the idea that I'm immortal, that somehow I'm endowed with certain special powers that make me immune from injury and death. Once again, these personal fables can be positive or not so positive. If one develops a personal fable that's very empowering and very positive, and the person tries to play out this personal fable, that can be very positive. They can set a script for themselves, so to speak, that moves them forward in a positive way. On the other hand, if they have a personal fable that's very negative, that says that they have a very low esteem, that they're worthless, that they'll never amount to anything, then that personal fable can be very, very destructive. Another aspect of adolescent cognitive development is thinking in multiple dimensions. I've already mentioned earlier the whole idea that one can start to see things from different perspectives. And with adolescents, they start to develop some subtle understandings of variances of possibility. So it's not just black and white, it's not just good and evil, but they start to see shades of gray between these two polar extremes. They understand that they need to show different behaviors in different settings and places and times, and that there are different rules for these different settings, places, and time. Humor can be a way of showing their understanding of multiple dimensions. They may see the irony of something that's good in one situation, but is actually bad in another situation. The text talks about adolescent relativism, that while adolescents may seem very egocentric and very self-centered, they may also have a very relativistic view of what's right and wrong. That the relativist teenager might start doubting many things that they thought were true and stable and reliable up until the time they're 12, 13 years old. And then all of a sudden, they start to see things very differently and they start to doubt these things. They may become very skeptical of parents and teachers, and I think you can see how that can set things up for rebellion. On the other hand, my experience has been that many teenagers and adolescents can be very moralistic and can have a very strong sense of what's right and wrong and preach what they believe is right and wrong to their parents, to their teacher, to their peers, and so on. So there are a couple of different perspectives here. There are changes that are taking place in the brain function during adolescence. We see the idea of synaptic pruning, where the many synapses and connections that were being made during the early childhood start to be culled away, to be pruned away, to be discarded, which allow for stronger, deeper, and more reliable synaptic paths to be established in the brain. And you'll see in the course that I've posted an article about the possible interaction of this synaptic pruning with schizophrenia, that schizophrenia often comes on in adolescence, and there's been a lot of question about why that is. And it appears that one of the possible connections may be that there is this synaptic pruning going on, and schizophrenia goes about this pruning in a dysfunctional kind of way. It may take away certain connections that should be there. It may attack connections that need to be in place. Another thing that's going on with brain functions is that we see addiction and issues of risk and reward in adolescence, and these may have their roots in changing brain functions. For instance, the adolescent brain creates some amounts of dopamine, which are related to the pleasure centers of the brain. And these can be all activated by things like drugs and sexual activity and smoking and other activities which aren't very good for you. But they do excite the pleasure centers of the brain. And so these become very powerful motivators and very powerful forces that move adolescents towards these dysfunctional kinds of behaviors. On the opposite side, there are responses in the brain for response inhibition that are developing, where the brain is holding us back from going about doing these not so functional things. And so that's a counterbalance to the pleasure center activities. We see discussions about different forms of intelligence in adolescence. Stern talks about his triarchic theory, that intelligence is componential, that involves acquiring, storing, and processing information. We see that a lot in mathematical operations that adolescents are doing. There is also experiential intelligence, where we're developing insight and creativity, and so we might see that in some of the artistic activities that that adolescents get involved in. And finally, there's contextual intelligence, thinking practically. And so those people who like to think practically, like to fix things, for instance, like to fix cars and computers and so forth, they might have a very strong sense of contextual intelligence. Stern says that our total picture of intelligence is composed of all three of these, and we may show certain preferences for some of these types of intelligence over others. Same thing with Gardner's multiple intelligences model or theory. He says similarly that there's artistic intelligence, music intelligence, physical intelligence, and so forth. And our decisions, for instance, about our future occupations can be related to our preferences towards certain types of these intelligences over others.